Cowboy helped Apache escape the fire, and the voice calling his name froze his blood. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. John Hartley was a man of the land. A cowboy by trade, a rancher by heart. He had settled in the wide expanse of the desert, far from the bustling towns and the prying eyes of civilization. The days were long and the nights even longer, with nothing but the wind and the occasional coyotes to keep him company. But in all his years of solitude, nothing prepared him for the events that would unfold that fateful evening. It started with a fire. The sky above was darkening quickly, a storm was rolling in from the horizon, but John hadn't expected it to be a firestorm. The wind howled through the dry brush, and before he knew it, flames were licking at the edge of his property. He rushed to grab the bucket and the well, but the flames were moving faster than he anticipated. The wind was pushing them, turning the fire into a beast of its own, hungry and relentless. John's heart raced as he ran, desperate to save his home. He grabbed what he could, trying to beat the fire back, but it seemed hopeless. That's when he saw her. A flash of movement through the smoke, a figure running toward him. It was a young Apache girl, barely more than a child, running for her life. Her eyes were wide with terror, her clothes singed at the edges, and her face covered in soot. John didn't think. He just acted. He grabbed her by the arm, pulling her close to him, trying to shield her from the heat as they both ran toward the riverbank. The fire was catching up, but he couldn't leave her there. As they reached the water's edge, John could feel the heat on his back, the smoke thick in the air. He didn't know who she was or what she had been running from, but in that moment, it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was getting her to safety. They jumped into the river, the cold water a sharp contrast to the blazing heat that chased them. John pulled her through the current, keeping her head above water as they struggled to make it to the other side. His muscles burned, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Finally, they reached the other side, the fire now a distant roar behind them. John collapsed on the riverbank, breathing heavily, the young girl beside him, trembling but alive. He looked at her, her dark eyes staring back at him with a mix of gratitude and something else, fear maybe. It was then that he heard it. A voice. A voice that seemed to come from nowhere, but it was unmistakable. It was calling his name, echoing through the trees, cutting through the sound of the wind and the river. John Hartley, the voice whispered, chilling him to the bone. The words froze him in place, his blood running cold. He turned, but there was no one there. Just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, and the girl beside him, still shaking. What did it mean? Who was calling him? Was it someone he knew, or something more sinister? As John sat there, trying to make sense of what had just happened, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The beginning of something he couldn't escape. A fate tied to the Apache girl, to the fire, and to the voice that haunted him now. A fate that would change his life forever. John sat there, the cool river water lapping against the shore as the Apache girl beside him continued to tremble. The fire had been left behind, but the fear that gripped his heart only grew stronger with each passing moment. The voice had called his name again, but he couldn't make sense of it. It was a haunting whisper, one that seemed to come from nowhere, yet it had an unmistakable weight to it. He could still hear it echoing in his mind. John Hartley. His blood ran cold, and despite the warmth of the evening air, a chill settled deep within him. He turned to the girl, whose eyes were wide with a mix of fear and something else, recognition maybe? She hadn't spoken a word since they made it to the riverbank. John wanted to ask her what was going on, but the words stuck in his throat. He couldn't shake the feeling that something far bigger than just a fire was at play. The girl looked up at him, her eyes dark and intense. "You heard it too, didn't you?" she whispered, her voice shaky but clear. John nodded slowly, not sure how to respond. "Who was that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl hesitated, her gaze shifting nervously toward the trees, as if expecting someone, or something, to emerge from the shadows. "It's a spirit," she said softly. "A spirit tied to you." John frowned, confusion clouding his thoughts. A spirit? What did she mean? He had heard stories about spirits, about the land being alive with energies that could not be explained by simple words. But he had never put much stock in those old tales. Now, though, with the fire and the voice calling his name, he couldn't help but wonder. "What spirit?" John asked, his voice tinged with frustration. The girl turned to face him, her expression serious now. "The spirit of the land," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "It's been calling you for a long time. You just didn't listen." John was still trying to make sense of what she was saying when he heard it again. The voice. Louder this time, unmistakable. "John Hartley," it called, cutting through the silence of the desert. John's heart skipped a beat, and he stood up abruptly, scanning the horizon. There was no one there. The girl stood too, her body tense as if bracing for something. The air seemed to thicken, and the temperature dropped suddenly. John could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. He took a step forward, trying to make sense of everything, but the girl grabbed his arm, stopping him. "You can't run from it," she said, her voice urgent. "It's coming for you." John looked at her, bewildered. "What is?" he asked, his voice a mixture of fear and confusion. "The past," she replied simply. "The past you tried to forget. It's come to claim you." Before John could ask more, he felt it, a shift in the air, a sudden sense of being watched. He turned, but once again, there was nothing there. The land around him was vast and empty, the dry earth stretching out in every direction. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him. The girl pulled him back toward the riverbank, her grip firm. "We need to leave," she said, her tone sharp. "It's not safe here." John was still trying to make sense of the girl's words as they began to move. But something in the pit of his stomach told him she was right. Whatever was calling his name was not something he could ignore. And whatever it wasn't going to let him go without a fight. They moved quickly through the brush, John's boots crunching on the dry earth as he followed the girl's lead. The night was falling fast, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the desert. The air had grown colder, the once warm breeze now carrying a chill that seemed to seep into his bones. Every step they took felt like a step deeper into a mystery that was becoming more and more impossible to ignore. The Apache girl, whose name John still didn't know, moved swiftly ahead, her dark eyes scanning the terrain with an intensity that made John uneasy. She had been quiet since their brief exchange about the voice, but now she seemed to be listening for something, as if attuned to sounds he couldn't hear. "What's going on?" John finally asked, his voice low, as though speaking too loudly would disrupt the silence that had settled over them. She didn't answer immediately, instead pausing for a moment, her body rigid with focus. "We're not alone," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The land is restless." John frowned, trying to make sense of her words. He had always been a man of logic, of hard facts, but everything about this situation was pushing him to question his understanding of the world. The voice, the chill in the air, the way the Apache girl had looked at him. There was something strange happening here, something far beyond a simple fire and a chance encounter. "Restless?" John repeated, his mind racing. "What do you mean by that?" She glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. "The land remembers," she said softly. "The spirits of the past never leave. They wait for the right moment." John's mind raced back to his childhood, to the stories his father used to tell him about the ancient powers of the land, the way it could speak to those who were willing to listen. But John had always dismissed those stories as mere superstition, tales meant to entertain or frighten children. Now, as the shadows stretched around them and the temperature continued to drop, he couldn't help but wonder if there was some truth to them after all. What does this have to do with me? John asked, his voice tight with anxiety. The girl turned to face him, her gaze piercing. You've been marked, she said simply. John's heart skipped a beat. Marked? He repeated, his voice barely a whisper. What are you talking about? She stepped closer to him, her eyes never leaving his face. The spirits, the land, they know you. They've always known you. You've been running from it, but it's here now. John felt a cold shiver run down his spine, as if the very earth beneath his feet was alive with something he couldn't see. He glanced around, half expecting to see something emerge from the shadows. But there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of desert, the night, and the sound of his own breathing. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice more desperate than he intended. You've already saved me once, she said, her tone softening. But there is more to be done. You can't escape what's coming. John's mind was spinning. The voice, the girl, the strange pull he felt towards something he couldn't understand, it was all too much. But one thing was clear, whatever was happening, it wasn't something he could outrun. What do I have to do? He asked, the words escaping him before he could stop them. The girl didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned and began walking again, her pace quickening as if the answers she held were too heavy to speak aloud. You'll know when the time comes, she called over her shoulder. The land will show you the way. John didn't know what she meant, but something deep inside him told him that he would soon find out. And when he did, he would have to face whatever fate had been waiting for him all along. They walked for hours, the desert stretching endlessly before them. The horizon a faint line against the darkening sky. John had lost track of time, lost in his thoughts as the girl moved ahead of him with a purpose, her movements fluid and sure. He tried to keep up, but his mind was clouded with confusion and doubt. The voice, the girl's cryptic words, it was all too much for him to comprehend. He had never been a superstitious man, never believed in the supernatural, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him, something that had been waiting for this moment. The desert seemed alive with it. The land, as the girl had said, was restless. It was as if the earth itself was calling to him, urging him forward, but towards what, he wasn't sure. He had been running from his past for so long, hiding from the choices he had made, the people he had hurt, but now, in the heart of the desert, there was no place to run. The girl stopped suddenly, her body tense as she gazed out into the distance. John halted beside her, his breath catching in his throat as he saw what she was looking at. In the distance, barely visible in the fading light, there was a figure standing in the sand, unmoving. It was a man, dressed in worn clothing, his face obscured by the shadows. John felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The figure was standing alone, yet there was something unsettling about his presence, as if he had been waiting for them. "Who is that?" John asked, his voice tight with apprehension. The girl's eyes flickered toward him, her face unreadable. "That is the spirit of the land," she said softly. "He has been waiting for you." John's heart pounded in his chest as the figure began to move toward them. His steps were slow, deliberate, as though he was walking through the very fabric of time itself. With every step, the air seemed to grow colder, the desert quieting as if it too was holding its breath. "What does he want?" John whispered, fear creeping into his voice. The girl didn't answer immediately, her gaze fixed on the figure as he drew closer. When he was only a few yards away, she finally spoke. "He comes to guide you," she said. "To show you what you must face." The figure stopped a few feet in front of them, his presence overwhelming. John could feel the weight of his gaze, even though the man's face remained hidden in the shadows. The silence between them stretched out, thick and oppressive. "John Hartley," the figure spoke, his voice low and ancient, carrying a sense of both power and sadness. "You have come to the end of your path." John felt his stomach tighten, his body frozen in place. He had heard that voice before. It was the same voice that had called his name in the desert, the voice that had haunted him since the fire. The voice of the land, the voice of the past. "What do you want from me?" John asked, his voice shaking. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the folds of his cloak and pulled out a small, weathered pendant. He held it out to John, and for a moment, John could only stare at it, unable to move. The pendant glinted in the dying light, its intricate design familiar yet foreign. "Take it," the figure said, his voice barely a whisper. "It is a symbol of what you must face." Slowly, John reached out and took the pendant, feeling its cold weight in his hand. The moment his fingers touched it, he felt a rush of memories flood his mind, memories of a time long buried, of choices made, of lives lost. The past he had tried so hard to forget was suddenly alive in him, overwhelming him with its weight. "This is your burden," the figure said, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "You cannot run from it any longer." John's mind was spinning, his thoughts fragmented as the memories came crashing down around him. The fire, the voices, the choices he had made, it was all coming back, and he could no longer deny it. The figure took a step back, his eyes never leaving John's face. "The time has come to face what you have done," he said. "Only then will you find peace." With that, the figure turned and began to walk away, his form fading into the shadows of the desert. John stood there, his hand clutching the pendant, feeling as though the weight of the world was pressing down on him. He had come to the desert to escape, but now he realized there was no escape from the past. It was time to face it. Time to make things right. John stood still, the pendant still cold in his hand, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of everything. The figure, the voice, the girl, it was all too much for him to understand. The desert around him seemed to close in, its vast emptiness pressing against him, reminding him of his isolation, of the life he had tried to build after the fire. But now, all of that was in question. His past, the choices he had made, the lives he had touched, it was all coming back to him in ways he wasn't prepared for. He had always been a man of action, someone who dealt with problems head-on, but this was different. This wasn't something he could fix with his hands, or his rifle. This was something deeper, something he had been running from for years. The girl, still by his side, watched him with an intensity that felt almost too much to bear. She hadn't said much, but her presence seemed to speak volumes. She had led him here, to this moment, and now she was waiting for him to take the next step. "What do I do now?" John finally asked, his voice low, almost defeated. The girl stepped forward, her eyes never leaving his face. "You face it," she said simply. "You can't keep running from what you did." John swallowed hard, his grip tightening around the pendant. It was as if the weight of his past was pressing down on him, suffocating him, and no matter how hard he tried to shake it off, it clung to him. "I don't even know what I did," he muttered, the words feeling strange coming out of his mouth. The girl's gaze softened for a moment. "You know," she said gently. "You've always known." John shook his head, the memories still fragmented, still just out of reach. "I don't remember," he said, his voice cracking. "I don't remember what happened." She didn't answer right away, but instead, she reached out, placing her hand over his. The touch was warm, grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. "The past has a way of coming back," she said quietly. "And it will keep coming back until you face it." John nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. He knew she was right. He couldn't outrun his past forever. He had to face it. The girl took a step back, motioning toward the horizon. "The answers are out there," she said. "But you have to find them." John glanced toward the desert, the vastness of it stretching out before him. It felt like an endless sea of sand and silence, but somehow, it didn't seem as intimidating as it once had. The girl turned to leave, her footsteps light and purposeful. "I'll be here," she called over her shoulder. "When you're ready." John watched her walk away, her form disappearing into the desert, and for the first time in years, he felt a strange sense of clarity. The past wasn't something he could escape. But maybe, just maybe, it was something he could understand. He stood there for a moment longer, the pendant still clutched tightly in his hand. Then, with a deep breath, he turned and began walking. The desert was waiting for him, and so was his past. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't keep running. It was time to face it. The desert stretched on endlessly before John as he walked, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. The wind had picked up, the dry air cutting through his clothes and making him feel more exposed than ever. He wasn't sure what he was searching for, but he knew he couldn't stop moving. The girl's words echoed in his mind, the idea of facing the past, of finding something that had been buried for so long. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the air grew cooler, and the shadows grew long, stretching across the land like dark fingers reaching out to him. John's heart was heavy with uncertainty, but also with a strange sense of purpose. He didn't know what the past would reveal, or what he was supposed to do with the pendant in his hand, but the longer he walked, the clearer it became that he had no other choice but to face whatever was coming. He reached a small outcropping of rocks and paused, looking out over the desert. The wind howled around him, and for a brief moment, he felt like he was the only person left in the world. There was a vast emptiness around him, and yet the weight of his past seemed to press on him more than ever. As he stood there, his mind drifting, he heard something, a sound that cut through the silence like a whisper on the wind. He turned quickly, but there was nothing there. No one. The only thing in sight was the endless desert, the sky darkening as night began to settle in. For a moment, John stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He was sure he had heard something, but there was no sign of life around him. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. It was just the wind, he told himself. He had been out here too long, and the isolation was getting to him. But then, he heard it again. The whisper. It was faint, but unmistakable. John Hartley. The voice seemed to come from the desert itself, like a breath carried on the wind. His blood ran cold, and a chill crept up his spine. This time, he didn't hesitate. He dropped the pendant into his pocket, and turned toward the sound, walking quickly in the direction he thought he had heard it coming from. His heart beat in his ears, and his senses were heightened, every sound and movement making him jump. The desert felt alive now, like it was closing in on him, pressing him towards something he couldn't yet see. As he walked, the whispering grew louder, clearer, until it was almost like someone was right beside him. John Hartley! The voice called again, and this time, it sounded like it was right behind him. He spun around, but again, there was nothing. The desert was empty, the only movement the dust swirling in the wind. But the feeling that he was not alone, remained. The air felt thicker now, like something was in the air, just out of reach. The sun had set, and the desert was bathed in the eerie glow of twilight. John's steps quickened as the voice seemed to grow stronger, pulling him forward. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do, but he knew he couldn't stop. Something was guiding him, pushing him to continue down this path. His feet moved automatically, carrying him forward as the darkness deepened. The desert around him was silent now, the wind dying down as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something. The sense of urgency in John's chest grew stronger, and he felt his muscles tense with anticipation. The voice was now louder than ever, and with each step, he felt closer to whatever it was that awaited him in the darkness. He reached a narrow canyon, the walls rising steeply on either side of him, cutting off the horizon. The air was cooler here, and the ground beneath his boots felt firmer, more solid. The whispering had stopped, replaced by a deep silence that pressed in on him. He took another step, his heart racing. And then, he saw it. At the far end of the canyon, standing in the dim light, was a figure. A man, tall and imposing, his features shadowed by the darkness. He was facing away from John, standing still as if waiting. For a moment, John hesitated, unsure whether to approach. But something in his chest urged him forward. The man didn't move, didn't speak, but John could feel his presence. The figure had been waiting for him. Without thinking, John moved closer, the ground beneath his feet crunching softly with each step. The air around him felt heavy, like the weight of 1,000 memories pressing down. The man finally turned, his face still hidden in the shadows. But John didn't need to see his face to know who it was. He could feel it in the air, in the pull of fate that had brought him here. The past had caught up with him, and now it was time to face it. John stood frozen, staring at the figure in front of him. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of everything he had been running from pressing down on him. The man was still standing there, facing him, but his features remained hidden in the shadow. John couldn't move, couldn't speak. All he could do was stand there, feeling the cold night air on his skin, feeling like the world had shifted beneath his feet. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive, until finally the man spoke. "You've come." The voice was deep, calm, but full of something John couldn't place. It felt familiar yet distant, like something he had heard in his dreams. "I didn't think you would." John's breath caught in his throat. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling despite his efforts to sound steady. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly turned, taking a step forward. The shadows that clung to his face shifted slightly, revealing just enough for John to see the outline of his features. The man's eyes, though shadowed, seemed to pierce right through John. "It's not about who I am," the man replied, his voice still steady but now carrying a weight that seemed to settle around them. "It's about what you're here to face." John felt his legs tremble beneath him. He had no idea what the man was talking about, but every instinct in his body told him that this was it. This was the moment when everything came crashing down. He had been running for so long, trying to outrun his past, trying to forget the mistakes he had made. And now, it had caught up to him. He didn't know how to face it, didn't know what would come next. "I don't know if I can do this," John whispered, more to himself than to the man. The figure took another step forward, his presence filling the space between them. "You already are," he said simply. "You're already here. That's the first step." John's mind spun, his heart racing. "I don't understand," he said, looking up at the man, desperate for answers. "You will," the man replied. "But first, you must let go of what you've been holding on to. You've been carrying it for too long, and it's time to release it." John's hand subconsciously reached for the pendant in his pocket, the weight of it suddenly feeling heavier. "Let it go," the man urged, his voice calm but insistent. "You can't move forward until you do." John closed his eyes, his hands still gripping the pendant. He had carried it for so long, a symbol of his past, of the mistakes and regrets that had defined him. But now, standing here in the desert, facing the unknown, he realized that he couldn't keep holding on to it. With a deep breath, he pulled the pendant from his pocket, staring at it for a moment before slowly letting it fall from his hand. The wind picked it up, carrying it away into the night. John watched it disappear, feeling something shift inside of him. It was like a weight had been lifted, like a burden he hadn't even realized he was carrying was finally gone. The man watched him, his expression unreadable. "Now you can move forward," he said quietly. "But remember, it's not about escaping your past. It's about accepting it and finding a way to make peace with it." John nodded slowly, the weight in his chest easing for the first time in years. "I understand," he said, though the words felt strange on his tongue. The man finally stepped back, his form fading into the shadows. "Good," he said, his voice growing distant. "Now go. The path is yours to walk." And with that, the figure was gone, leaving John standing alone in the desert, the night stretching out before him like a vast, uncharted horizon. John stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. But one thing was clear: he had finally faced the past. Now, it was time to face the future. John took a deep breath, the air in the desert cool and still, as if the night itself had been holding its breath, waiting for him to make his next move. The man, the figure, had disappeared, but John could still feel the weight of his words pressing on him. The past, the choices he had made, the things he had done, they were no longer something he could hide from. The land, the spirits, had a way of bringing it all back to the surface, forcing him to face what he had tried so hard to avoid. For a long moment, he stood in the silence, the vast emptiness of the desert stretching out before him. It was as though the world itself was watching, waiting to see what he would do next. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't run anymore. John glanced around, feeling the pull of something deeper now, something beyond the desert and beyond the figure who had appeared to him. It was a calling, one that had been buried in his soul for years, a whisper in the wind that told him to keep moving forward. He could feel it, a strength rising within him, the same strength that had carried him through the worst of times. He had survived. He had made it this far, and now he had to find a way to make peace with everything that had come before. Slowly, John began walking again, his steps sure but steady. The desert was still, the only sound the soft crunch of his boots against the dry earth. His mind drifted to the girl who had led him here, the girl who had been his guide in this strange, unsettling journey. She had shown him the way, but it was up to him to find the answers he needed. He didn't know what he was looking for, but the path seemed to be clearing in front of him, the shadows of the past fading just enough to allow him to see the next step. As he walked, John's thoughts turned inward. The land, the voice, the figure, they had all been part of this moment, part of the lesson he had needed to learn. He wasn't just facing his past, he was learning to live with it, to accept the choices he had made, and to move forward. The desert seemed to change with every step he took, the landscape shifting subtly as if responding to his thoughts, to his presence. The air grew cooler, and the silence seemed less oppressive now. It was as though the weight had lifted, just a little, as if the land itself had accepted his decision. After walking for what felt like hours, John reached a small hill overlooking a quiet valley. The moonlight bathed the landscape in a soft glow, casting long shadows across the rolling hills. The view was peaceful, serene, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, John felt a sense of calm. He stood there for a long while, looking out over the valley, his thoughts quiet for the first time in years. The desert had been harsh, unforgiving, but in the stillness of the night, he felt something shift. He wasn't running anymore. The past no longer had a hold on him. And for the first time, John Hartley felt at peace. The journey was far from over, but he knew now that he had the strength to face whatever came next. The morning sun rose slowly over the desert, casting a warm golden glow across the land. John stood on the small hill, his gaze fixed on the valley below. The night had passed in peaceful silence, and now the desert was alive with the sounds of the new day, the gentle rustling of the wind, the distant calls of birds, and the soft murmur of the earth awakening. John took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill his lungs, feeling the weight that had been on his shoulders for so long begin to lift. The journey had been long, and the past had been heavy, but in this quiet moment, standing in the vastness of the desert, he felt something new, a sense of freedom. The girl, who had guided him through the dark nights and into the light of understanding, was nowhere to be seen now. John didn't know if she had been real or a spirit of the land, but he knew one thing: her words had been the catalyst for the change he had needed. He was no longer running from his past. He had faced it, accepted it, and now it was time to move forward. As he looked out over the valley, John felt a connection to the land, a bond that had been there all along, waiting for him to notice. The desert was no longer just a place of isolation and hardship. It was a part of him, a reflection of the journey he had been on, barren and harsh at times, but also beautiful, full of quiet strength and resilience. With a final look at the valley, John turned and began walking again, his steps purposeful. The path ahead was still unknown, but he knew he was ready to face it. The sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the land, and John felt the first stirrings of hope in his heart. The desert had taught him that even in the harshest conditions, life could thrive. And so could he. With each step, he felt a little lighter, a little more at peace with the man he was becoming. There was still much to learn, but for the first time in a long time, John felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The past no longer had a hold on him. The journey was far from over, but he was no longer afraid. He had faced the ghosts that had haunted him, and now, with the desert stretching out before him, he knew he was ready for whatever came next. As the wind picked up again, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dust, John smiled to himself, knowing that the road ahead would not be easy, but it would be his own to walk. The desert had given him the strength to face his past, and now it would give him the courage to build his future.